So welcome, everyone. My name is Bill Green. I'm the director of the MIT Energy Initiative. I want to thank you all for coming to our seminar tonight. We hold these seminars to try to keep the MIT community informed about what's happening in the energy space and the important work that's happening on campus and in our community to decarbonize the energy system. As you all know, the climate change is getting more and more apparent in wildfires, in hurricanes, in extreme weather all around the world. And in order to tame the climate change, we really need to tame our emissions to keep reduce the amount of greenhouse gases being emitted. That's a pretty challenging task because so much of our economy is based on technologies that emit greenhouse gases. And so here at MIT, we work pretty hard on trying to find substitute technologies that can provide the goods that we all want without destroying the environment. Our role at the MIT Energy Initiative is to connect the campus with industry. We bring in the big companies who provide significant funding to support energy research on campus. We convene meetings of the big companies, the small companies, the nonprofits, and the government to discuss energy technologies and energy options, trying to find a path forward that the society can agree to. And from our funding, many of the faculty make inventions, and the inventions often eventually lead to startup companies. But getting a startup company, as a new graduate student leaving MIT with an invention, it's a lot of steps from there to actually having a real business that would actually materially affect the climate. And tonight we're very fortunate to have Emily Knight here. She's going to talk about one of the key steps when a company is first getting started, how to foster it, how to help it connect with the resources it's going to need to thrive and grow until it can grow to be out on its own as a real business. And then there's actually additional steps after that to try to scale to really be material for the whole world. But many companies fail at the first stage when they're young, and MIT helped to organize the Engine as a organization to help foster those. And tonight, Emily, the CEO of the Engine, is going to tell us about her important work. So I ask you all to join me in inviting Emily Knight.
All right. Is this working? Yeah. Okay. Thank you for having me. This is very fun, and I love talking about the Engine. To give you a little bit of background as I get into this, I have been at the Engine, I think now for about 7.5 years. I was maybe the 7th or 8th employee. And as the Engine was spun out of MIT, I think the idea was how are we creating, a couple of the buzzwords were an innovation orchard, and I'll call them patient resources. So really important technology was being developed in a lab. And the licensing mechanism or the funding mechanisms were creating a speed that meant you would follow the funding because you would follow it with speed, and you didn't have the time and patience to sort of develop a market or what that could look like. And licensing could happen to a corporate, and maybe the technologist and the inventor of the technology didn't have the time to think about all of the applications. And I think President Rife, who had this initial idea, wrote this wonderful op-ed where he used a technology called Liquid Glide that was eventually licensed to a ketchup company to go on the inside of a bottle to get every last drop out, as opposed to thinking of all of the other applications, whether it's energy, whether it's climate, whatever that could be for this type of technology. But to do that, you'd have to have the time and patient resources to be able to think about market development. And so that was a lot of what we were trying to do, this innovation orchard, and filling the gaps that we saw were out there. And so our mission from the very beginning was to support and accelerate what we call tough tech companies, who had this vision to solve some of the world's biggest problems. They'd had the opportunity to think about those problems, those markets, and go really from lab to market. So the idea of idea all the way through investment, whatever that looked like at the many different stages, and then ultimately impact. So thinking about commercialization, not just that you've licensed it and spun it out, but really what is the ultimate impact there. And so we use this pathway, idea to investment, investment to impact, in a lot of the work that we do, and thinking about all of the gaps and how we're constantly sort of evolving our resources and how we help a team based on the gap they're facing. A little bit agnostic of technology and sort of in line with their pathway. So tough tech, most of the investors we bring to our building immediately call it deep tech, and we're like, careful, there's a hole in the floor that's going to open if you say that one more time. We invented the tough tech language, I think, because we wanted it to mean a couple things. So tough tech meaning tough is durable. It is going to stand the test of time. It is also solving a really tough problem. So again, it speaks to the time, the duration, that we're asking people to go along this journey, whether they're investors, the LPs in the fund, or the resources. So the ability to have a physical infrastructure that allows people to stay there for a long time. That is another piece of the tough. And then the engineering component. A lot of the companies, there are very few, if any, straight software companies that are in our orbit or are in our physical incubator, because a lot of this is this sort of new convergence of life sciences and engineering, and there's a physical engineering component. So one of the things when we designed our spaces that was critical was that we had big, high bay open space so that a company could put a 30-foot crane in there or drive a car in there, or that physical component to it as well. So that's how we define tough tech. Comes up quite a bit. This is a little bit of our original, very basic valley of death theory, that we were really bridging the gap and the many gaps. A lot of the early stages, this is a little bit of our evolution. The early thesis was around these sort of two components. Capital, so what is catalytic capital that can be an intervention moment, and then the startup resources. And so from the very beginning, we had a focus team led by Katie Ray, who has always been doing the venture side and who has built over time this incredible portfolio, supported and built this incredible portfolio of companies. And we always had this physical space. And actually, it's funny, I just saw Jonathan, who was probably the first person I met at MIT, when I said, how do we connect all of our startups to everything at MIT? And how can we do that? And how do they get access to a core facility? And in my second week, I had a team say, we need a flow cytometer, or we need cages, and how can I get that without buying it, and how can I use it on an hourly basis? So all the resources, the patient resources that go along with these companies to support them, and then this catalytic funding. And so these like 4 different swim lanes, the sort of programmatic aspects that we've done around convening and what it means to create an ecosystem and to start to share our learnings and bring people along this journey. The infrastructure, which was a lot of the work that I did in thinking about critical resources, experts, any of the things that fill those gaps. And that was anywhere from my example of a flow cytometer to asking MIT to put a satellite on one of their roofs. Like it was anything we could think of and we would ask for. And then the development of the funds. And so ultimately, after what I would call a lot of progress and success, we came to a point where we had opened our new huge facility right down the street at 750 Main Street. We had, it's about 200,000 square feet. We had just under 100 companies working in the building. And Katie and the investment team were going out to raise Fund 3, which would ultimately put them at about $1 billion under management. And so we had this moment of scale where if you called this whole thing from the beginning an experiment, we felt like the experiment was working. And so now these 2 sides to one organization actually were to really, we were at a critical moment of scale where they were at a moment where they needed to specialize. And so we now operate as 2 organizations. We share a mission and a name and operate very much in parallel ways, but they are clearly a very specialized and well-run venture fund who has a focus on building a portfolio. And we are an incubator and accelerator focused on building a platform and creating what I believe is an open community for people who want to build tough tech, who want to fund tough tech, who want to work at a tough tech company, and ultimately be a part of this community. And so this is now our mission as this standalone organization where we are providing, and our execution of our mission looks like this critical infrastructure, these programs that we run that are spanning that pathway of idea to investment and investment to impact rather, and then building this ecosystem and constantly finding the people that are going to help these companies in whatever it is they're doing, many of which is first of a kind. So a little bit about the infrastructure. Today we actually have 3 buildings. The first building we moved into, we still operate. We have this new wonderful facility right down the street. And then as a fun experiment in the middle of COVID, I think it was, we rented a warehouse because CFS mentioned they might need a little bit of space, and then they took over the whole thing. So that's been a fun, that sort of need-based concierge, like, what do you need? Can we find it in the market? Can I connect you to resources? The scalability of that is that we don't always have to be the people running a building or leasing the building. We now can be that connector. Just before this, I was having a conversation about a team moving potentially from Ireland. We're happy to actually connect the resources because physical infrastructure real estate actually becomes a critical moment for scale for a lot of these companies. The unique pieces of our building, I will say, are that we run everything top to bottom. So the entire building is a program. And every piece of equipment that the Mobius team and Marty Culpepper helped us pick out the entire list of equipment that we needed, and we pressure tested that against everyone in the building. We think about everything the teams are going to need that they had here and that there's critical mass around that it makes sense for us to buy, or how we can then look to the community and say, well, the UMass core facilities have all of these pieces of equipment available. Some are at UMass Boston, some are at Lowell, and you can use them for this amount of money. We've now found the resource. We don't have to buy it. But the idea that we are running this in a lean fashion, but also helping these companies operate at speed. I had a one-on-one with a brand new CEO. They moved into our building a week ago, and he said that the reason he ended up in Boston was because of the resources. He said this was the most expensive market where he could move to, but the engine gave him the ability to, within 3 days, get to a bench and start working with all of the equipment he needed in the most lean fashion, so it represented speed. And that's a lot of what we think about. What is speed? And efficiency. So if he has a certain amount of money to hit milestones, he needs to use that money as efficiently as possible. And so watching him spend it on overpriced benches or space where he has to rent 5,000 square feet instead of the 500 that is his bench, our model is to constantly find those ways to make it more efficient. And so we have everyone on our team who is thinking about providing the resources and providing that value add. So this is not just a bench. This is also a community. This is where you're doing your learning, and that's the program aspect as well. So we have run a number of programs, and I'll get into 1 or 2 of them a little bit more, but I think for as close as we are, and will always be, I think, to MIT, one of the things that not a lot of people know is that this is a platform actually for all institutions. And so there is so much activity coming from MIT, and so with our Blueprint program, that is for what we call proto-founders, I think over 50% of the participants are typically from MIT. But we have over 120 other institutions where the proto-founders and the technologists come from as well. Inside of our building, we run a number of programs that are all about, so sort of anything you can think of, the founder development. So this leader that is going from PhD student typically to CEO, that is a really, really big journey that happens the minute you get funding. And so you get $3 million and all of a sudden you're the CEO. And so we're really interested in bringing people along that journey so that there is less moments of friction. There will probably always be friction, and that's like the part of the learning journey. But your knowledge of knowing that you're going on that journey is a big part of what we want to do. And knowing that you're in a community of people who are doing that same journey is really important. We had fundraising seminar this morning that was led by one of the CEOs who's about to start a fundraise, and asked like another 20, 25 CEOs to join her. And we'll facilitate, but really they're trying to create community around, I have to do this in a tough environment. I have to do it in a much bigger inflection point. I'd love feedback. I need a safe place to do my pitch. I'd like to know what good looks like. And I'd also like to confidentially share what's been going wrong. And so that's like a very unique value proposition that we have with all of these CEOs doing a really hard thing for the first time in their career, potentially taking a technology into a first-of-a-kind market, creating their own market, or doing something very different on this very long, tough journey. So that community piece is very important. These are sort of a number of the programs. Blueprint and Whiteboard, I'll talk about in a minute. We run an annual summit. I think the idea of the summit is always really to put a huge focus on tough tech and bring all of those stakeholders around the work we're doing. So obviously investors are a huge part of this journey, but government is also a really big deal. So government as a customer, government as a funder, government as a market, thinking of all of those different verticals. Academia, a lot of these technologists are coming out of, if not MIT, another research university and may have an academic co-founder. So how are you transitioning out of the university and keeping that relationship? What is the relationship with your lab ongoing? And if you think about also future talent, that is a way that we engage with that group. And then the other founders are a big piece of who we connect with at the summit. Providing the toolkit is this really amazing program that we have that is basically a library of every resource you could have. Pattern matching is something we try to do quite a bit. So we'll give a case study about Commonwealth Fusion and the decisions they had to make for some of the really early stage companies. They're not at that same inflection point, but when you understand that having to pick a business model, or if you think, are we going to buy the HTS tape, or are we going to make our own, and then we become our own supply chain, and then we can sell it for revenue, you start to think about how your technology can map against those different business decisions. Our interest right now is in constantly learning and sharing, and so we can educate. I think a future state for us would be to start collecting all of these case studies and all of these different stories that we have access to from the 100+ companies we work with, and becoming a little bit more of a research place where we can research the different models and share that as well. So that is part of the program that we think about quite a bit. Blueprint is something we run twice a year, and really was born out of the idea that there's a lot of work being done around entrepreneurship, but to start a tough tech company, there are so many different risk factors that you have to think of. I think in the first class or first week of this program, the example is usually used that, so let's say on the scale of Instagram to Commonwealth Fusion. So Instagram, there was very little technology risk. They knew how to build that, but it was a market risk. Like, do people want to share pictures? Are they going to want to do this? And that's what they had to figure out. Market risk is not that hard. You do have to figure out, but when your technology is not hard to do, so that's your sort of that type of company. Commonwealth Fusion, I would say, had the scaling risk. They had the market risk. They have a market for sure, but how to plug into that market is really interesting. All the technology risk, if you think about it, and then regulatory. So these 4 different things they have to think about, just instead of, is there a customer? I think therapeutics is another one, because you have a market, you have sick people, and now you have to develop the drug. So it's sort of thinking of the scale of all of these things, and we think it is very important for a technologist who is leaning towards commercialization to understand this ahead of time, and so you will have a higher degree of success if you understand and can build this sort of pre-company launch. And so our Blueprint program focuses on people who are probably about a year or 2 out. They're still in their PhD program or postdoc, and are just leaning towards commercialization. And so we bring you through this 8-week journey that also prepares you with what I would compare to a deck if you were about to go out and fundraise. The idea is not that at the end we have a prize or we do funding. The idea is that you're really excited about entrepreneurship and you want to further engage, or that you went through that process and said, I don't think I'm going to be a CEO, but I would really like to work at one of those companies, and I think I understand more where I could plug in. And so that educational component of being able to make that decision, but being more informed, is a big part of what we're doing. This is a little bit more about the curriculum. We sort of focus on these 4 risk areas. If there is anyone here who's interested, we are closing applications, I think, next Friday. And it will be our 10th cohort, and we typically have about probably 60 to 70 teams that go through each of the cohorts. It's an 8-week program, and we have a number of pretty incredible mentors that are involved. We have a lot of the entrepreneurs in our ecosystem, in our building, come back after they've gone through the program and can be entrepreneurs. And they do so with a different perspective than maybe a venture capitalist will, who would be thinking, I'm not going to invest, it's too early, or like, I don't know that you're ever going to get there. The idea is that we're encouraging the discovery of this pathway if you are leaning towards entrepreneurship versus, yes, you can do it or no. And so if you're interested, please apply. And if you are interested in being a mentor to this community as well, we'd love to have you. Another one of the programs that was actually born out of Blueprint was a number of faculty members went through our early Blueprint cohorts, but weren't asking the same questions that the future CEO or the founding team was. They were asking about what is my role if I'm going to join this startup, and how does if I don't intend to leave my position, how do I do this, and what does that look like? And how am I going to have a conversation about equity with my student? And so we developed a one-day program. We do it a couple times a year, and some of the wonderful faculty at Sloan participate. So we bring in some of the pairings that we have of one of the CEOs with their faculty co-founders. They talk a lot about that relationship. And this program is really about human capital, so your role there, how you deal with this evolving relationship with your student. Intellectual capital, the intellectual property, how you think about licensing, how you start that journey, and then financial capital, what it looks like to finance these companies, what your role is, having like really gnarly conversations about equity well before you're in the room to have that conversation. And so giving faculty members who are really thinking about commercialization, creating a really entrepreneurial lab, the space to have those conversations with people who do it regularly and ask those questions. Anyone is welcome to participate. We do it typically in June and then again around October. And that is, we will do a call. So anyone who's interested, again, please let us know. The ecosystem piece that we do, I think, is right now probably more important than ever. Our Tough Tech Summit and a new program we do, Tough Tech Week, are really meant to bring all of the people in not just Boston or Massachusetts, but people who are focused on this together to have the same conversation and make it go a little bit quicker, I'd say, in every way. I was listening to one of the MITEI podcasts this morning. It's called What If It Works? Is that what it's called? I loved that was the how it was. We did an ecosystem building early days around Commonwealth Fusion, and the sort of thought experiment was so what if it works? Assume the technology works. What else will this group have to think about? And so that's when you think about all of like if the technology works, you take out that risk profile. What do you do about regulatory? Is anyone thinking about that? How do you site and permit a fusion reactor? Where can you do that? Who's prepared to do that? How can you bring along all of the NIMBYs? And how can you have a public campaign about fusion? How do you get people excited? How do you plug into a market? How do you price it? And so the really fun, I just loved that was the what if it works, because the conversation that you have to have with yourself, with your board, you have to assume it's going to work. If you're only ever worried that your technology won't work, you won't pick your head up and have the right people on your team who are building the public affairs relationships so that when you need it, you can get your first fusion reactor sited and done, or you don't know where to go for the next round of funding, and you don't know who in government is going to be your advocates when you need them to be. And so it's, I loved that title. It's how we think quite a bit, how we build our team, how we constantly bring in more resources around this platform. are, let's assume the technology works. What else should we be getting in front of? And who do we want to bring around us to help push on those barriers and have that conversation? So that leads me a little bit, and I think that's on a future slide. Let's see if I can skip to that one. So we think a lot about public affairs and government. I think the Commonwealth Fusion one is a fun one, and they're just so big and scaling. But I think their 8th employee, those are like a particularly very smart group of founders. I think their 8th employee was a public affairs person. I think Kristen's title was government or public affairs. And so she created so many early relationships. She did so much storytelling about what they were doing so that when there was a snag on where they were going to permit their site, they could call local government and it could be done. And so we watched that. Part of our job is constantly learning and sharing. So if this is something they're going to go through, siting and permitting for a first-of-a-kind technology is going to happen to everyone. We brought in an in-house specialist who could do that. His name is Ben Downing. He was a former state senator. He'd also worked at a solar company, so he sort of was uniquely in this interesting position, not just in Massachusetts, but pretty well connected, that he could be that public affairs person for all of the companies in our building. So Ben is a little bit of a expert in residence. He can get ahead of what they need to do. He can help them think about sort of government engagement, creating awareness, thinking of government as a supporter, as an advocate, and maybe as a future funder. Thinking about access to capital then, so when they become a funder or a marketplace, when you can sell to government or when you're getting grants. And then our ability to convene people, so bringing them closer to us so they care about what you're doing. Some of that, we have tried to convene the local ecosystem to really care about what it is Tough Tech is doing, to be the home to things like fusion or clean cement. Another great example, once Ben was on our team, the Sublime Cement team was looking at their first site. And so Ben is from Western Mass. All he talks about is Pittsfield. And so they came to him, I think, with a list of 6,000 sites and said, would you help us do a site review? And he said, I'm not going to look at all 6,000. I can tell you there are 3 on there. I think it was Pittsfield, Holyoke, and maybe Amherst, that has a municipal utility system that's like 75 to 90% clean energy, which is what they needed. And so they came back to him and said, it's funny, we came up with the same 3. And so through his connections, he was able to help them get that site and then build a number of other really great programs to get DOE grants and an OSED grant. And so there's all of these opportunities because we have this sort of extra muscle that can help them. Turns out he also knew someone out there who could then be their public affairs person. But community programs are also a huge part of when you're applying for a grant, that you're showing that you're building out a community program that looks like job development and investing in that community. And so we were able to help them win these grants because we had that knowledge of the community. And so it's another moment where really trying to get all of these data points, learn what we can in real time, and then share that out with resources that either we have connections to or that we bring in-house. The other slides I think that I skipped over are really about our convening. So the number of events that we look to host in our facility. We were lucky enough to have the former First Lady come to Boston and come to our space and really highlight a bunch of women's healthcare initiatives. We have a very large number of unique visitors to our space every year. And to us, that really just represents people who are we can bring closer on this journey. Tough Tech Week is something we did this year, as I mentioned, around our Tough Tech Summit. I think one of the things that is probably more important than ever is not to divide and conquer. None of this should be a race to the bottom. It's actually our thought about operating out of abundancy and not scarcity. And so there's many layers we do that. We think a lot about Greentown Labs, about Lab Central, about all of the other incubators and accelerators, and how we can use our very limited resources most efficiently, cut out any of the redundancies and work together to support teams. An example, when the late January, when the federal funding freeze memo came out, I know a lot of people freaked out. We also have an NSF grant, and so we had a moment of how does this affect us on our team? How does this affect our business and our exposure with some of the people who pay us rent? And the flip side of that is how do we support those teams who are now exposed and can't pay rent or can't pay salaries? And so we had our internal 750 Main Street thought, And then we said, if we're going to host a town hall tomorrow and bring in our other government resources, our legal resources, and our financial teams, let's make sure that all of the teams at Lab Central, who is just on the other side of the building, let's make sure that the Greentown folks, the Activate fellows down the street, anyone who's also uniquely affected by this in this science and technology ecosystem can also come. And so a big part of what we're trying to do is just reach our hands across and let everyone know that the rising tide that we're trying to create, this movement that tough tech, no matter what it is meant for everyone, and that we can all work together and benefit from it. So this was something we did last year, and we'll do again this year. We just came up with the date. And so looking to across universities, across different ecosystems, investors, and sort of all of the work that's going on here in Massachusetts, highlight this as the home for tough tech, but also as the hub to this bigger network. One of our board members is the CEO of the Boston Globe and owner of the Red Sox, Linda Henry. And so when I was equating this to what they do, yes, people we are the home to Boston Red Sox fans, but also they talk a lot about Red Sox Nation. And so we can be the home to tough tech, but it's really important to build that bigger national connectivity. And this, I'll tell you, is why when this opportunity to work on this national economy, tough tech capacity building grant, we raised our hands and jumped in immediately. So NSF, I think at this point, probably 2 years ago, maybe a little bit more, put out an RFP for what they were calling regional innovation engines. There is a lot of the work that Fiona Murray did and Scott Stern, I think, that helped write some of the work that got to the grant, which is why I think there's also a complete overuse of the word engine. But so the engines, these 9 regional engines that were picked after all of this work, each have what we call one tough tech vertical. And so this has given us the ability to look at all of these ecosystems, and a lot of them are set up differently, but have someone kind of like our organization, typically a nonprofit, or they're operating out of a university, where they are trying to connect all of those stakeholders. So they're trying to get local government involved. They either have industry or they're trying to attract industry. I'll give you a couple examples. What's a good one? So the North Carolina Textile Innovation and Sustainability is about the circular textile economy. There isn't a whole lot of technology there, but they have all the industry. They have a ton of the manufacturing and old industry. And what they need to do is engage a future workforce who are going to work there and become the hub. And so in their instance, what they would like is to attract people who have a technology who can help that industry and become the center of excellence around the circular economy, because that's where all of the manufacturing and the industry is based out of, or I think it's something like 60 to 70%. And so they're able to attract companies from California who want to be around this. One of the companies in our building, Macrocycle, who is recreating virgin plastics, actually is trying to connect there because they will have the feed that can help them. And so our ability to connect them to technology, because they're probably not spinning out technology or developing at the rate of an MIT or another research university, is how we can help them. As opposed to the other engine in North Carolina for regenerative medicine, they have a ton of technology coming out of Wake Forest. And so where we support them is what it looks like to create an accelerator, an incubator who is building entrepreneurship muscle for the technology and creating more commercialization, and then what a support system looks like around them. And so a little bit of a different angle for all of them. Our role here was that we want to be able to help the scaling technologies that we have in Boston and Massachusetts in our building think about what it looks like to scale. And I'll go back to a Commonwealth Fusion or Quaise Energy. They will never have every single one of their units, whatever it may be, in Massachusetts. So to scale, they need the future infrastructure around the country, and they need to know that it's easy to talk to this university or this group that's doing it. And so this was version 1 of how we could start to create the national infrastructure for a tough tech network. The second wave of this, I would say, is a grant making from the Department of Commerce for the tech hubs. So I think there's been somewhere between 31 and 40 tech hubs that were designated, and that typically will look like infrastructure, so a testing or a pilot facility or test beds in one of these designated tech hubs across the country around something like fusion or battery storage or mining, critical mining. And so we can, once again, start to create connectivity between not just the startups, but the research and where those critical test beds and infrastructure are without everyone needing to build their own and without all of the money coming in to just finance the infrastructure if it exists somewhere else. So we think a lot about, again, this idea of home for tough tech, and this is a hub, but of a national tough tech network supporting this tough tech economy. And I think this is just another version, I think I've said this before, but really all of the different groups that we have to engage, all of the different stakeholders. Risk capital is a big part of what these startups need at early stages. Most of the startups in our building right now are somewhere between a pre-seed and a Series B. Academia is one of the most important stakeholders, not just because that's where a lot of people are coming from, but because those relationships, I think, look a lot easier once you've seen people do it and once you've seen them come out of there. And so whether we're connecting with researchers or faculty members or the licensing offices, it's a relationship we care about making that process easier and seeing more translation activity. The corporates are important because they support us, they support the ecosystem, and they represent customers for a lot of these businesses. I think government and ecosystem I've talked about, but so this is sort of the breadth of the way that we choose to connect with people. And then for fun, I put in a couple of the companies that work in our building or are actually probably graduating out in the near future. Lithios is one that came through our Blueprint program. We met Mo, the founder, really early on, and that led to him going to get funding and ultimately becoming a resident. And they're breaking ground and will be moving into their new facility pretty soon. So they're leaving the engine now and graduating out. Really interesting technology around low-cost lithium. Let's see. Lydian is another really interesting company. We met their founders through Blueprint as well. They are doing sustainable aviation fuels. Really cool company, also at this critical stage where they're graduating out and they have a space that they're about to open in Charlestown, probably late this year. But we met them at this earliest stage when they were still in the lab and have seen them through this whole journey. And I think now they're probably up to about 20 people. Macrocycle, really interesting company that I was talking about earlier, has this sort of dual market around food and plastics and then the circular textile economy. And they are able to take waste and reproduce it into virgin grade recycled plastic. Really interesting. They've been in our building for about a year and a half. They've just raised a pretty good round. And they're at this critical moment, too, of thinking about what their business model looks like and which pathway they have to go. So probably a really fun business case for a business class to think about what the two pathways are, and incredible founders that we get to work with. Pretty small team that scales up every summer with about 6 to 10 interns from MIT typically. And then the most fun example, I'd say, is Commonwealth Fusion. They moved into the furthest left picture here is when they were in our first facility. It was just the four of them, and then they sort of took over more and more space. We had rented, part of our space was an old Radio Shack, and so they turned that into the Magnet Shack. But sort of that evolution of all of the stages they went through as a part of the system. And obviously, they've had an incredible luck in fundraising and supported by the Engine Ventures team. And we've had a lot of fun being able to help them with all of their very strange asks on space and facilities and resources. And so that's been a really fun company to be involved with as well. And then a little bit more about the Engine Ventures team. I'm sure the portfolio company number is greater than 55 at this point, but more than 3 funds at this point, over $1 billion in management, and just an incredible group of people who care deeply about that founder journey and the humans behind these companies and invest way more than financial capital. They invest a ton of time in those people. So anyone, again, who is out there looking for money, I would highly recommend that you get in touch with that team. So that is sort of the arc of the engine and where we are today and all of the crazy things that we do. So I'm happy to move on to the next piece.
Yeah, so that was very interesting. So from MITEI's point of view, we're mostly interested in the energy companies. So Commonwealth Fusion is, of course, one, but there's many of them. I think if I looked at the world, 3 years ago, the countries were all competing to subsidize the clean energy technologies. And so is the IRA, there's subsidies in Europe, Japan is subsidizing stuff too. And now suddenly with the political shift, it seems like all that subsidy stuff is going to shrink, or at least shrinking some. I'm wondering, how does that feel to someone running an incubator, and what's, how to proceed?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that my first answer is there's just a lot that we don't know yet. I think so from our very small perspective, we have this NSF grant. We immediately worried that might go away. I think there's different elements to that. So what was it about the grant that funded it? Why did we get it? And could we continue to do it? So that's a lot of the thinking we've been doing. I think there's just around 10 companies that we work with in our facility that are completely grant funded. So we've done that sort of work with all of them, whether it's NIH, NSF, or maybe DOE. You have to kind of go back to basics of what did the grant say, and are you going to be able to do it? And there are unfortunately some, and I hate to even say it, that had been asked to include statements about DEI and things like that. So they've now been flagged. When I take a step back and I think about, for example, the NSF engines, most of them are in red states. Most of them are in states that will largely benefit red states. And so I don't know that they will be able to walk back the economic development elements there because of the excitement around them. I think a lot about some of the elements and the investment in infrastructure from the IRA as well. It's really hard to say how much will be cut for the right reasons. We just don't know. And so we think a lot about this. We have a lot of conversations. We have a new, not just Ben on our team who thinks about this, but other consultants who are trying to help us regularly. I think for those that have not been told to pause their work or have not had that happen, they're continuing on. They're putting their head down. They've pivoted conversations. I had a board member of mine, a brand new board member is Tom Khalil, who has worked for Schmidt Futures and now Renaissance Philanthropy. And his advice to me was talk about energy security, not climate change, talk about national competitiveness, national security, and likely every one of the companies will still really matter. And like that's how you work around this. And so that's the advice we're giving the companies. But there are very small companies who had, less than a year of runway and are pretty terrified. And so we're out there thinking about funding mechanisms that could be more reliable. And that's our role as an incubator. I think that's why we're convening all of the other support groups around, talking to the local government as well. I think Governor Healy is really invested in climate right now. So that's the best we can do. We don't have the answers. I don't think most of the people who had won grants from whether it was the LPO program, from OSED, some have gone through, but there is just still quite a bit of uncertainty.
Yeah. And you had a plot in one of your early slides of the Valley of Death, and maybe you could talk about what an incubator can do to help companies get through that really difficult time when many investors are not really willing to put as much money into the company as it really needs to grow.
Yeah, so I think this is hard to say after my last answer. One of the things that we used to say quite a bit was non-dilutive funding is there to support that early stage development. SBIR grants, all of that non-dilutive funding could do that. Right now, so part of the reason that we created this 501c3 was that I could go out and find other funding mechanisms. So one of the programs that we are trying to find funding for is free lab space. If you have a small amount of money and you have to give it to us because that's this sort of old business model we've been backed into, what if I could go out and fundraise so that you all had free lab space and you didn't have to pay for that at this early inflection point, or if it gave you 2 years to have free lab space while you built what you needed. There's also wonderful programs out there, fellowships. There's a that will give you money for R&D credits, will give you a stipend. The Activate Fellowship is one that we're closely partnered with and thinking of alternative ways to support these fellows. And then there's, really interesting models. The Prime Coalition model, Sarah Carney created this. I'm looking at Fiona because she is on the board and was an early supporter. It's a really interesting model of catalytic capital and how, but for this money, the company wouldn't exist. And so there are people that I am trying to push to raise those types of funds because they have those networks. And then on our end, we're looking at philanthropy to really subsidize some of this work.
Yeah, that's really great. Maybe you can talk about the differences between different companies. So you're doing tough tech, but it's all different fields.
Yeah.
I guess the energy companies might be in a kind of different space than some of the other companies, and
the building. It's so where everybody sits or how they sit or what it looks like. I think what's a couple good weird examples. So. A quantum company isn't necessarily an energy company, but in one of our physical spaces, I'd say it's about 2,500 square feet. We have a company that has 2 quantum freezers, and I think there's about a 900-degree difference over 30 feet from their quantum freezers to Mantle Capture, who's doing direct air capture with molten borates, and so their ovens are getting very, very hot next to this extremely cold. And so that's a really unique example where we're not very energy efficient because of the water coolers and the ovens. And they are right next to Macrocycle, who has their digester, who was also next to, they're moving out now, but Circe Bio, who was doing sort of a biofermenter of taking fats and turning them into gases and fuels. And so really interesting versions of energy companies, all in this very unique space, which means we have to really, so that they don't have to think about, they have to be very safe and they have to be very careful, but so that they don't get bogged down in those details, we can be that umbrella for them. And then a company like Lydian worked in our chemistry labs, and they could work next to, Lydian's doing the sustainable aviation fuel. They can work next to Copernic Catalyst, who's doing the development of ammonia. And so the idea of our physical facility was that it was a space that didn't exist. So we weren't actually, it's all evidence to the contrary, but the idea of this was not that we became a real estate company and were a co-working space. It was that we were filling a gap that didn't exist. There was not a space where you could go into a chemistry lab, develop something, go into a bio lab, see if it worked together, and then go downstairs and work on a water jet or a mill or a lathe. And all of those things, that convergence of the life sciences and this physical engineering didn't exist in one space. And from what we could tell from Tough Tech, that's what we needed. And so when there's a company that looks like they should be at Lab Central, we say, you should go to Lab Central. They're incredible. And if they look like they should be at Greentown because they really don't need this convergence, we would send them there as well. And so the idea is that you have to really need the convergence and be invested, I'd say, also in being a part of the community. But so the space was designed that you could go into these different spaces, whether it's an optics lab, electrical lab, we have an additive manufacturing lab, we have a complete machine shop with the help of Marty Culpepper. We have 30,000 square feet of what we call shared chemistry space with 40 plus fume hoods and a number of shared analytical equipment, and then another 30 plus thousand square feet of BSL2 biospace with tons of equipment added there that is all shared and available to everyone, and then with this sort of ancillary support where we can connect them to equipment all over Kendall Square, Boston, and then sometimes the rest of Massachusetts.
So I was really struck by this. So you're supplying not just the physical space, but presumably the safety guy, the facilities person who's taking care of the equipment. You told us about the public affairs person. Maybe you can talk about this. I'm a co-founder of a small company. And for us, each of those things would be like a salary, and we don't have enough money to pay so many salaries. So it's like this is a very attractive model, not just for the physical space, but the...
Yeah, I think all of this speaks to the idea that I had mentioned earlier about that sort of speed and like really accelerating and efficiency. This same founder that I was chatting with this morning who said he ended up here, when we dug in a little bit, because he was like, I don't really like your procurement system. And I was like, okay, fair. Can I tell you why we have it? And so one of the things we do, especially if you're a bio company, life sciences, doing any mRNA, you have to have an institutional biosafety committee. And so even if you're a two-person company, you have to have a chair of the institutional bio committee. You have to have at least two other people, I believe. And then you have to have community members. So people who are not a part of your company, who not benefit, but live in Cambridge, who can poke holes. And so instead of every single one of these brand new companies needing to do that, we do that for them. So we run the IBC, we interact with the city of Cambridge, we have recruited the community members, and we treat each of the companies like a department. And so when we run our annual meeting with Sam from the city, I think the last time there were somewhere between 18 and 20. And so he like hears them, and the community members ask questions, and very thoughtful questions, but to maintain that there is safety there. And so on top of that, we do all of the permitting. And we can do the permitting and in the EHS because we do all of the procurement, which is the site that this person wasn't loving. But because we control the procurement, we can make sure that if I'm on a 5-foot bench trying to do something, whatever you bring in isn't going to infect that. Or someone doesn't go rogue and bring in a virus that we don't have a permit for. And so the way that we can control for all of these things is by one procurement system and inventory system and permitting system. And so while they may think, like, that's annoying, you can control this, we can then say, yes, but you don't have a procurement person or an inventory person, and you don't have to worry about safety in EHS. And we do all of the chemical safety and all of the training. And so that represents, as we learned, quite a bit of efficiency. And even when people don't think it's that efficient, or they think that our safety officers are a little annoying and the meetings are boring, at least 3 times now, I think, as a company has moved out and they've opened their lab, they have called and we've had a number of really great lab operations directors, they call them immediately and say, oh my God, I have no idea how to do this. And so we'll share the entire lab operations manual and the safety manual that is open source. But that all of that is taken for granted, and the stuff you don't know when you're building a company, and would really slow you down in terms of humans and cost and learning. And so that is, when I showed the slide of all the different groups who run our space, I'm bragging about the wonderful team we have, but I also think of them all fundamentally as a part of the program. So we have wonderful experts and residents who are literally teaching things as programs. And we have a lab director and a facilities director who think of themselves as operators and program directors. Another good example is we have a company that we love very much who was bringing in a roll-to-roll machine as they were moving into a new lab. Kevin, our facilities director, said, can I help with that? Can I bring a rigging company? And they were like, no, we got it. We don't need your help. So the roll-to-roll machine came in and was 4 feet longer than our elevator. It also couldn't come off the truck because the truck didn't have a lift gate. And so very quickly, Kevin became everyone's trusted resource that I don't know how he found a way to get it up there, but he did. And now you don't do anything in the building without asking him, because he's not there to slap you on the wrist. He's there to help you. So I have a very unique background that is, I am not technically trained. I went to the Cornell Hotel School, and so my ethos across all of this is about service. And so 7.5 years ago, when a founder said to me, where can I get a flow cytometer? I was like, I don't know, but I'll go find one. And so the idea was, what if we thought about this not as yes, no, or we have it or we don't, but we'll go find it. And so our whole team builds the program and the systems around, if we're here to fill the gaps, you tell me what the gap was, and we're going to try to do that. And again, part of this raising philanthropic dollars is that if this is a service and a mission-oriented organization, and we can find the funding to constantly fill those gaps, whether today it's for a quantum company who needs some type of thing, or a lithium company who's looking for this, that can evolve. And then, like the Commonwealth Fusion example of, we saw how important public affairs was, that's going to be important for all of these companies, whether it's permitting, it's regulatory, it's just relationships. Let's go fund those gaps, because then we can have a repeatable service.
All right, I think we have time maybe for one or two questions. Maybe right here.
Oh,
here's the
microphone.
Would be helpful. Yeah, we can hear you better.
Hi, thanks. So I'm Kimberly Samaha. I'm the CEO of an international, I would call us kind of an energy foundation. We operate in Boston and in Paris and in Beirut. And so we've got a big picture view of this. And I think some of your points about energy being something that's quite different is important to lens in here, because we've got, when we try to bring through the valley of death energy companies, which is what we do, you have interconnect issues. You have the other parts of what you're talking about in terms of connections is important. So I think this is a question and perhaps an invitation at some level that when we're talking about when we look at that valley of death, it's about trying to get these companies into real places that have interconnections, because if you start with that, you're years. So we worked very closely with the state of Maine back about 6 years ago, and the states are very interested in taking basically distressed assets. So all of these old manufacturing facilities and mines, we got called into the Appalachians, and so there's a big opportunity here, I think, because of the Trump administration, because I think, we've seen it. We're DOE grant people, so it was like, bye-bye. And so now, but the opportunity is manufacturing coming back to the U.S. and data centers. And all of this is going to be exponential for energy. So I think there's something here, where we can move our organizations, because we're also a 501c3, into something where we can start to maybe focus on states. When you talked about that innovation ecosystem, they tried to do that a few years ago with the states, and it fell apart. I mean, the states were just not ready to do that. But the intermediaries, if we really could create things that show the pathway the way that you've been doing this, I think that's an opportunity. So, I'd like to hear your thoughts about it, but it's also somehow an invitation.
Yeah, I think it's, again, I think when we applied for the NSF grant, I think there was a little bit of an internal discussion and with our board about, is this mission creep? Is this really what you were supposed to do? And when I take a step back, I think about some of the conversations. Probably 6 months prior to that, there was a conversation about Form Energy moving to West Virginia, and they were going to hire 700 people. And where were they going to find those people? And so fast forward to us applying for this grant, and one of the key pillars of the grant is workforce development. And so imagine if we're a part of a national conversation, looking at all of the different models for this, whether it's like I talked about the two North Carolina engines. One has the industry and the expertise. One needs to attract it. I think this is a way for us to think about this concentrated capacity building and then the future of that. And so when I think about what it looks like after this grant is over, one of the many things that we can do, just because now our knowledge is, so we can map the infrastructure. So here's 9 ecosystems we've worked with really closely. We know what their capacity is. We know how you could partner with them and what that looks like. So the next layer is these tech hubs, some of which are funded or just designated, but I think there's 41 of them total. That represents infrastructure, one of which is in Maine. The engines we represent are a type 2, they're designated type 2, which means they're fully funded. There's another 44, I believe, that were type 1s and won a developmental grant for the next phase. And Maine has at least one of those as well. But my point is that what we're interested in doing is actually aggregating all of these, and whether it's just, the first phase is just like a nice map where you can see what they are and maybe you know how to connect, and then actually thinking about an efficient, tough tech national network. I don't think we know what that means yet, but on a regular basis, today was one example. I tried to connect a founder to the North Carolina engine because he could be very interested in what's going on there. They would be interested in his technology. And so our connectivity is one, mapping it to show everyone, And then I think our relationship with NSF, who knows what it'll look like in the future, but we're very interested in creating resources that can live on and that are open so that you can actually see this national infrastructure and understand how to plug into it without maybe the funding is what's pushing everything right now. So what does it look like if you're just a company who wants to plug into the infrastructure at one of these tech hubs? So I accept your invitation. I don't entirely know what it looks like, but I think what we want is for all of the work we've done and all the connections, not to just go sit on a shelf somewhere, but to actually become a part of our bigger mission and platform.
All right, well, given the time, I think we'd better stop, but thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
I want to thank everyone for attending. I just have a few announcements. Next Tuesday at 5 p.m. in this room, we'll hear a very different talk. It's by Volodymyr Kudrytsky, the former head of the Ukraine's Ukrenergo, their energy company, the electricity company for Ukraine, about the challenges of maintaining the electricity grid in Ukraine while the country was under attack, and the challenge also of rebuilding their damaged infrastructure. We're co-hosting that talk with the MIT Ukraine program, the MIT Security Studies program, and the Belfer Center of Harvard. We also ask everyone to join us next month, April 30th, for the next seminar in the MITEI Presents series, Advancing the Energy Transition, when we'll welcome Manish Babna, who's the CEO of the Natural Resources Defense Council, for our colloquium in honor of Earth Day. And then in May, we'll have the final talk of the semester, which will be, we'll be hosting Emily Carter, who's a professor of energy and environment at Princeton. And we thank you for the advertisement for our podcast, What If It Works? There's a QR code on the slide you can use. I know at least 4 or 5 of these podcasts are pretty fantastic. I highly recommend you listen to them all, and you can make your own judgment which 4 or 5 you like the best. So please enjoy, and thank you again.
Yeah.